Welcome to the 58th New York Film Festival presented by Film at Lincoln Center. I'm Devika Girish. I'm one of the programmers of the festival's talk section, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this very exciting conversation. This is the first in a new series of talks this year called Crosscuts that brings together filmmakers from across the festival sections, styles, and genres. And this is really a pretty incredible and unique conversation to start off the series. As you can see, we have some amazing guests on screen, and we'll get to them very soon. But I just want to make a few remarks and thank yous before. The New York Film Festival has always been about bringing the community together to celebrate cinema. And whether you're joining us in our virtual cinema or at one of our drive-in venues, on behalf of everyone at Film at Lincoln Center, thank you for being a part of this historic edition. Thank you to the FLC board, patrons, members, and dedicated moviegoers who make our work possible throughout the year. As a nonprofit, we rely on your support, and becoming a member is a great way to join our community of film lovers, take advantage of discounts and special offers while helping us continue sharing the best in cinema. If you're not a member, please consider becoming one today. We're very grateful to our tireless staff and volunteers working behind the scenes to make the festival happen. In addition to screenings, you can access the New York Film Festival from anywhere with our free virtual talk series taking place throughout the festival. And do subscribe to the Film at Lincoln Center podcast for Q&As with filmmakers, panel discussions, recordings of these events, and much more. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you don't miss any exciting updates or festival announcements. And join the conversation on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook with the hashtag NYFF. Last but not least, a special thank you to our many festival partners, including HBO, who is the presenting partner of Film at Lincoln Center Talks. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest moderator for today. Rachel Rosen is a new member of the NYFF Main Slate Selection Committee. She is a San Francisco Bay Area programmer and awards consultant. Previously, she was director of programming for SF Film, which presents the annual San Francisco International Film Festival. She was also the director of programming for Film Independent and the Los Angeles Film Festival for 8 years. She has a degree in documentary film, and she's really passionate about nonfiction cinema, which makes her perfect for today's discussion. So thank you for joining us, Rachel. And now I'll let you introduce the incredible filmmakers we have with us today.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be moderating this conversation with these two extraordinary filmmakers. Hopefully you've seen both of their films. Maybe you've seen one or the other, and this conversation will spur you to seek out what you haven't seen yet. But it's my pleasure to have with me today Sam Pollard, who's the director of MLK FBI, which is a documentary about the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King that's screening in the Main Slate. We also have Gianvito, who is the director of Her Socialist Smile, which is a film about Helen Keller's socialism and her activism on behalf of labor rights and women's suffrage. It's screening in the currents section of the festival. So these two films have many things in common. They both bring to light less well-known elements of historical narratives that we likely think we know a lot about. They share some elements such as socialism, J. Edgar Hoover, and they also share some artistic sensibilities, but in many ways they're also quite different. So in some ways they're sort of like funhouse mirror reflections of each other in terms of content and style. And so I'm really looking forward to what we discover as we talk more about them, your work. And I'm thinking a good way to start out, because we've couched this as a conversation about films that have similarities and differences, but I think I'd like to invite you both to characterize briefly your own film work in terms of subject matter and artistic approach?
John, you want to go first? You want me to go
Not
first?
particularly. So go for it.
Well, Rachel, I am a child of what I call the Hollywood sense of cinema. I grew up in the 60s, 50s and 60s, watching lots of old Hollywood films from Paramount, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, MGM, and I fell in love with those movies, with all those movie stars. So when I got into the film business in the early 70s, my dream was to be a film editor of feature films, to sort of figure if I could emulate that approach to filmmaking. Now, I was taken under the wing of a wonderful editor named Victor Konevsky as I was working on my first film as an apprentice, and he introduced me to the world of documentary. And after working with him on documentaries for 3 years, I fell completely in love with documentaries and the idea of using documentaries to really delve into history, to learn about people's, their lives and the intimacy and the nuances of human beings' lives. That sort of, to me, is even more engaging than even fiction storytelling. And so for me, over the last 25, 30 years, I have embraced the documentary form and the approach to documentary, both historical, both verite, and basically looking at the idea that through that medium, I can find out about human beings and learn about history and find out how complicated life is and how human beings are. And I would say that for me as a documentarian, pretty much my influences have basically been the documentaries from the 60s, the ones by Penny Baker and the Maisels and those filmmakers. And, those are the films that sort of touched me and sort of informed my aesthetic. Now, I can't wait to get to the discussion about John's film, because I got a lot to say about that too, in terms of approach and how he came to how he wanted to, envision that material.
Well, I'm also grew up in New York City and was a cinephile and spent much more of my time in repertory cinemas and art cinemas than in the classroom at times, or that became my classroom. But at a certain point in that experience, I found that, and I can't pinpoint it to one particular film, but I remember coming out of some film and thinking, what just happened there? I killed 2 hours of my life, and I'm $10 poorer or whatever, but I'm never going to think about that film again. It was, and had this been the last day of my life, would I have been happy with the choice that I made watching that film? But at the same time, I was aware that there were films, didn't happen that often, but there were films that I had encountered that I almost literally felt myself a different person after seeing the film than I was going in, and that I carried those films around throughout my life, almost akin to lived experience. If they were fiction films, some of the characters were almost like people, that I knew that were part of my world. And so recognizing that film had, at least for me, that potential power, I felt that if I was going to make films, I wanted to make films that ideally didn't evaporate shortly after you saw them. Mike Nichols has this wonderful anecdote that he tells at great length, which I won't repeat, but basically where he just says, you know what a movie is? And he says it's about all the years you spent finding the story and the funding and then getting into production and casting, and goes through every stage of production just so that people can leave your movie and go, boy, wasn't that great? Hey, does anyone know where we can get a good bite to eat? So I don't, I have a relatively modest body of films. I don't know, 7 feature films and some shorts, but I know that to make any of them, it's usually going to involve many years of my life and many sacrifices, because I haven't generally had producers. So each of them comes from I have to feel that from the onset that I'm fueled with enough urgency to do this, that it'll sustain me through all the pitfalls of any production, and seeing it through. And so that search each time for what feels most needed within me, or that I feel most compelled to say, is what propels the films, gets them off the ground. And I typically say that if I continue to make films, and it's a question that I think it's healthy to keep asking oneself if that's the best use of my time and energy here on this planet, it's at this point to remind myself, first of all, and others, that there are a lot more important things than films. And so if that helps orient. And then in terms of the form and how they come, what they look like, and the influences that are brought to bear on that, it's such a amalgam of factors, and each one sort of organically finds its shape. I can see connections between the different films. Other times people say that they seem very disparate, but they're all my children and I love them each, so.
I mean, I think those introductions to your work make sense for me, because one of the things that I found was a cross-conversational theme about both your films were the inventive strategies you use to tell your story visually, audio. For example, Sam Pollard using narrative films, intercut about the FBI, and for her socialist smile, like the shots of nature, the sort of vaudeville theater setup. So another thing that I think is really interesting about both your films is that there's sort of a missing element at the heart of each of them. In John's film, it would be Helen Keller's voice speaking, which we hear just a little bit of. And obviously in Sam's film, it's those tapes that no one will hear until 2027. And, part of the content of the film is whether or not one should listen to them and what one should do with them once they become available. So that was sort of a pile-on, but I'm wondering if you can each talk about using all the tools that you can bring to bear to tell your story.
Well, in the case of MLK-FBI, it's going back to what I said at the very beginning here, how I was informed by these Hollywood films. Well, as I was sitting with Laura Tomaselli, the editor, we were starting to talk about the archival elements, the MLK speech at the March on Washington, the footage of him in Birmingham, going down to the footage from Montgomery, all that material. I also said to the editor, there's a cachet of Hollywood films that have dealt with the FBI and communism. And I just rang off all these titles because I'd seen all of these films. I was a communist for the FBI Story, Walk a Crooked Mile, G-Men, the TV show, the FBI. I had seen all of that because growing up in America, that mythology was all around me. I was inundated with it. And growing and becoming now a filmmaker who understands that mythology, I knew these were the perfect kind of tidbits in films to take scenes from, to sort of talk about, this brainwashing of America through J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. So, it's for me, every time I'm working on a documentary, it gives me an experience to reflect on things that I've grown up with, and now how I can see them in a new light, And you're right, Rachel, the fact that the big MacGuffin in this film is that you can't hear those audio tapes. And to me, part of my, strain and struggle sometimes when we were working on the film was the idea that, Jesus Christ, you're just going to read documents, you're not going to hear the actual tapes. But it's a little frustrating, but it's sort of a tease that we keep throwing out the breadcrumbs to you throughout the film, you know. So these were things that we considered and talked about as we were starting to shape the film. Again, those clips from those old movies, the idea that we had to make sure these documents were on the screen long enough and readable enough so you could really embrace them, knowing that you were not going to hear the audio. And the fact that we were able to find, which I thought was a great find, the audio stuff of Lyndon B. Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover talking about Dr. King and talking about his lifestyle. It was like a gold mine to me. Plus the footage. And this is one of the things for me about working on, I'm getting a little manic here, forgive me. It's one of the things about working on historical documentaries. When you go into searching for the archives and you find these gems, like that footage we found of James Earl Ray being arrested in London, and the footage of Dr. King with his family and his parents and his kids when they were young, that's like being, to me, an archaeologist, and you just found gold. You just found some wonderful, fantastic treasures you want to share. And that to me is part of the wonderful part of the documentary experience.
And I just have to say, Sam, just as a viewer, there were so many moments with King that I have just never seen before, and particularly very young, early footage of him. And I love the fact that you kept in things like the slates and the moments before the official record is being, laid down. And also, yeah, go ahead.
But you know, John, a lot of that stuff, those sort of aesthetic things, those are the influences of me watching those French New Wave films in the 60s, Godard, watching those films, like Pierre Lafaux and Band of Outsiders, those influences, that's what happens to me as a filmmaker. I'm influenced.
Everyone, it just, you can't, it's like you pointed, but it all gets absorbed in and filtered through. Yeah. And then to just make one other association, there, your film, doesn't have the ultimate unveiling of these tapes of that the FBI secretly recorded. But in my film, we don't have the FBI tapes of Helen Keller because turns out she rarely ever used the phone, so they weren't able to bug her, wouldn't have gotten them anywhere, and they weren't adept at finger spelling. So she was sort of off the grid, but there's other things I can say about it's much more nominal, the role that the FBI played in Helen's life, but we can talk about that if we want. In terms of, Rachel, your question about how some of those formal choices were arrived at in relationship to the archive, I don't know if I went into this in the earlier Q&A, but this was actually a project I had started maybe 21 years ago or so, and I had first learned about this aspect of Helen Keller through reading some of Howard Zinn's writing, and that first clued me into the fact that she had this dimension to her. But as I got interested in the writing and saw how still relevant I felt it was, I began looking at the Library of Congress, looking at the places that house her collections of her, and I just couldn't come up with the kinds of things that a filmmaker normally would need to, or imagine they would need to make a documentary, and it puzzled me because by the time she was 8 years old, she was famous, and by the time she graduated from Radcliffe, she was 20. She was internationally famous and one of the most famous women on the planet. And yet, through this large swath of time, I couldn't find any motion picture or photographic or audio recordings of speeches that she made at various rallies, and the film reveals part of the reason why that's the case, not all the reasons, but just to quickly sum up here, so what happened was I felt, okay, interesting idea, but for a filmmaker, I don't know that I can do anything here, and I abandoned the project. Fast forward many years later, and this voice starts nudging me saying, you know, you had this idea to make a film about the most famous blind deaf person. You have no images, you have no sounds. That's an interesting creative problem. You shouldn't back away from it. And just to give one instance of the nature imagery, it was through reading her, both of her autobiographies, that I became aware of just how passionately she was involved in the natural surroundings where she lived, how much sustenance she drew from that, and how eloquently she was able to describe in writing the experience of being alone in the woods. And then I also discovered that the house that she lived in during the most militant period of her, publicly militant period of her life, and where she always says in her biographies she was the happiest, was actually a 10-minute drive from where I live right now. So that became a sort of first portal to say, okay, there's a connection here that allows me some imagery that can play off of an aspect of her life. And also because I think our own individual relationships with nature has a very deep political dimension to it that we've often failed to acknowledge.
Just to follow this up a little, John, I think you talked about this a little in your Q&A with Florence, but I'm also wondering if, you know, I think as you said about your film, but I think it applies to both movies, that in some ways you're presenting different views of people who've been sanitized for public consumption. And in the case of MLK FBI, I think that's true both of Martin Luther King and of the FBI in terms of their stories being simplified in a way that sort of fits a narrative we want to hear. And what I want to ask about that is if in the process of trying to reveal more complex stories that you had some interactions in terms of accessing archival materials, whether there was resistance on the part of trusts or archives where you were trying to get materials that sort of wanted to stick to that sanitized version.
You know, well, in the case of MLK, surprisingly, and I was very surprised, we didn't get any resistance. I've been expecting to hear from the King family, you know, even now about their reaction to the film, but there has not been a peep. And when we went to go into the archives with our archival producer, Brian Becker, not once did he say we were gonna have trouble getting anything. And I've had other situations where I did have trouble, or I had archival footage of a particular person or subject where I used it a certain way, and then when I went to get the rights, I was told that I had to change it because the way I presented that person wasn't what they wanted to see. I'll give you a great example. When I was working on my documentary about Sammy Davis Jr., I had a section there about his relationship with Sinatra, and I was using footage from the Sinatra estate, and I had shaped it a certain way that the Sinatra didn't come off so well. And when I had to show it to the Sinatra estate, they said, unless you're going to re-edit that sequence, we're not going to let you use that footage. And I didn't have any of that with King, so I'm very surprised that there has been no pushback. Now, probably right after this, Rachel, I'll get a lot of pushback.
In my case, there's minimal archival materials that are interwoven, and they were easily accessible. I worked particularly with the Perkins School for the Blind and their Helen Keller collection, most of which they've digitized, although I visited there as well. And then the American Foundation for the Blind also has a major holdings, which are also digitally accessible. And then there are some other materials that came from different stock houses that I purchased the rights to over time. And in fact, the formal institutions that have her holdings, like the American Foundation for the Blind, I think today celebrate the full dimensionality of who Helen Keller was. This was not at all true during her lifetime, and they were very controlling of her and who got to visit her, so part of why some of that material may have vanished is because they didn't feel it was was the image that they wanted to preserve. This fundamental irony about all of the interest throughout the years in Helen Keller about that people's fascination with how she learned to read and write and speak, but then there's no interest in what she actually read and wrote and spoke. So this is an attempt at a corrective on that.
Yeah, very much so. So I wanted you also each to speak a little bit about what I guess I'll just call your narration strategies. In MLK FBI, I loved that you saved the on-screen faces of the interview participants for the end of the film, so that they functioned sort of as voiceover until very late in the film. And then I guess, John, I'd like you to talk about using Carolyn Forche and sort of that leaving the slates in decision to have her to show the recording session.
Well, if you've looked at my body of work, most of the docs that I've done, we follow sort of what I call the traditional method of talking head interviews coming on, interwoven with archival and stills, and back to the talking head interviews, interwoven with archival and stills. In this particular case, myself and the producer of the film, Ben Hadeen, right before we shot a frame of film, right before we even brought the archivist on, we said stylistically, let's not have anybody on camera. Let's make sure that we just sort of tell the story through the footage and the stills. And if we're going to have anybody talking, it'll just be voiceover. And the film that had influenced me was Black Power Mixtapes that come out a few years before, which used that same aesthetic. And when we first went to some funders and said we were not going to have any talking heads, they were a little sort of nervous and said, "Really? No." So we basically said to ourselves, we still don't want any talking heads on camera, but we'll shoot them on camera. We'll shoot all the interviews on camera, And then if we get in real trouble and people really can't handle this particular approach, then we'll be able to fall back on going to the talking heads. But, fortunately, no one did. I mean, no one really challenged it after we showed the first couple of cuts to our funders. They really went for it. And I want to make sure that I do a shout out to Laura Tomaselli, who really had the idea of going to them on camera at the end, because I thought it would just be all talking heads to the very end. And then when I came in, when she sent us one of the cuts, during the pandemic, and all of a sudden she got to the ending, all of a sudden there on camera was Clarence Jones and Beverly Gage and Donna Murch and Andy Young, and I said, "Oh, okay, I like that idea, that reveal." It was a very nice touch, and that hadn't been done before, So, you're always trying to, from my perspective, the influences of other films inform how I want to approach my films and maybe try to tweak it and make it slightly different, sort of like, every time you make a film, you're trying to figure out a new way to tell the story.
My impulses are very aligned with what Sam just said. It's a classic but more contemporary problem among documentary practitioners, that this issue of the disembodied narrator and the so-called voice of God narration. And I wanted to get away from that. And I thought, if I'm going to have, and I felt the need to communicate certain information through narration, that if I was going to have that element, that why not see the person doing it. And I think when you have just a sort of standard narration where it's not testimonies, as in Sam's case of first person narratives, you have choices. So you can always find somebody with, a great speaking voice and ability to deliver. But I also feel like for me, that's an opportunity to make that choice a sort of gesture of solidarity to someone who I feel connected with in some way in terms of shared politics, shared view of the world. So I long admired Caroline Forcher's writing. I'd worked with her in a previous project, and in fairness, she'll say she didn't know that I was going to bring in cameras until she arrived that day. But I think she's fine with it. Ultimately, none of us, probably not so many of us, enjoy watching ourselves on screen. But I know she's quite a supporter of the piece as a whole. So that was the thinking. I just thought it would get me off that classic hook about who that person is, that voice of authority there, and hopefully it works.
Okay, I have a question for John.
Yeah.
John, when I was watching the film, I kept thinking that, and maybe you weren't, maybe you were informed a little bit by some of Warhol's work and Stan Brackage's work, in just terms of vision, in terms of the way you use imagery and stuff. Is that possible? Is that the case or not?
I certainly know their work. They never come up on my own pantheon of filmmakers. Maybe, since you're asking, the first thought I come to who might be an influence a bit is, do you know the work of Jean-Marie Strobe and Daniel Houie?
Sure, I do.
And they're not only aesthetic but philosophical belief that humans aren't the center of the universe, and that the world around us has as much value on screen as the humans do. Strobe is often quoted often likes to quote this line from Rosa Luxemburg, that the fate of an insect is no less important than the fate of the revolution.
So I have another question that relates to this idea of just broadening our understanding of your subject matter. And again, thinking back to a question that Sam asks in his film that Cameron Collins also asked you during your Q&A about responsibility to the material. But that led me to think how difficult some of your editorial choices might be, like knowing that it's hard enough for filmmakers to kill their darlings when editing in any circumstance, how much harder it must be when you're trying to provide nuance, to decide about what details should be left in and taken out. So I guess I'm wondering if you talk a little about any struggles you might have had between your feelings of responsibility as artists, but who are telling a historical story.
I would say this. I would say that as a filmmaker who thinks of himself as a responsible filmmaker, also as an artist, I believe very strongly that when I'm telling these stories, I'm trying to figure out how to make sure that the nuances of a person's life, the complexity of a person's life, good or bad, black or white, are there. I grew up at a time where you could say these were the good guys and these were the bad guys. I know the world's not like that as I've grown, and I like to be able to dig into films that sort of say that that's not the world. So, the idea of looking at Dr. King from a different perspective, understanding that he was not only this, important figure during the civil rights movement, but he was a human being who had his own foibles or his own sense of, how he saw his personal life. And to me, I felt a responsibility to dig into that. I mean, there was a discussion that we had while we were editing the film, How far do we want to deal with the supposed rape allegations? Well, to me as a filmmaker, if I didn't deal with that, I wasn't doing my job as a filmmaker. I had to do that, you know. So to me, you got to be responsible, and you got to be able to say, I may catch some brickbats, but I'm trying to create another sort of layer about this human being than the one that most people identify with. And that to me is always a wonderful challenge when you're making these documentaries. You know, you come upon stories and things are revealed to you in the process, in the editing process, that you say, do I want to grapple with them, or do I want to say, oh, let me push it to the side? Now, most times I try to grapple with them, unless I get some pushback of outside forces that are controlling the funds and the money and say, no, you can't do that. Then I have to grapple and struggle with them. So to me, every film is about tension, about conflict within the process of editing and outside the process of making a film. That's what I call life.
Sam, can I just ask you, what was there any hesitancy about how much you were going to reveal about the skeletons in Hoover's own closet? You kind of hint a bit about some of what has been speculated about his personal life, but then I think one of the fundamental questions your film is dealing with is whether public figures are entitled to a private life, whether it's Hoover or King.
Well, the thing about Hoover's personal life is that it's all been conjecture. There's no factual evidence to prove that Hoover might have been homosexual. So,
oh, no. Okay.
We touch on it, but we don't, if there was, I'll be honest with you, if there was something factual that could be proved, that proved it, I would have put it in the film, and that's always my attitude. If there's something that I can substantiate and say that this is something that's been proved in fact, I will use it. And that was something I learned when I worked on Eyes on the Prize back then with Henry Hampton, that I had to be able to unclothe things that sometimes I didn't want to reveal,
So with the presentation of Helen Keller, I guess I was a bit concerned of it turning into some kind of work of hagiography, and there are dimensions of Helen's life and choices that she made at times that don't put her necessarily in the best light, or even writing of her that's not as eloquent as the pieces that I excerpted. But one distinction was I wasn't really, my intention wasn't to make a kind of biography of Helen Keller. I mean, it's that there are biographical dimensions to it, but they're somewhat peripheral. I was more wanting to take what her ideas, the ideas that I felt still needed to be heard and still had resonance today, and make it a film about that rather than about other aspects of her life. I mean, I do include the fact that she held on to her support for Stalinist Russia longer than many, and I even at one point had a title card that was a little maybe too cheeky that said even Helen Keller had her blind spots, and I think I wisely decided to edit that out. But I also want to shout out to, I had a co-editor, Eric Gulliver, who helped me navigate these decisions throughout the process. And even with the nature material, there were shots that I had that I just thought were absolutely stunning. And Eric would say, yeah, it's a very pretty shot. But he said it doesn't have a place in the film just because you think it's a pretty shot. So it was helpful to have him alongside the journey. Yeah.
And John, where did you find that fabulous Noam Chomsky material?
Noam is one of my heroes, and I consume a lot of his writing and videos and materials on a regular basis. I went to MIT and had the pleasure of encountering him there in the classroom, and have stayed close to him in whatever ways I can through the years. So that was just something that's up there online. The full speech that he gave was actually during a Q&A after a speech that he's asked a very pointed question about Lenin and I reached out to Noam to get his permission to excerpt the part that I did, which he was very kind to.
Yeah, that was one of the most articulate explanations of socialism I ever heard. You know, I said, wow, that really is very articulate expression of it.
He's a treasure.
Yeah.
National treasure, international treasure.
Another thing about both your films that you just alluded to, John, is that of course you are making them now because you think they have some relevance to us today. And it doesn't have to be, you know, I'm telling you this so you can do that, but that there is some lesson or echo in the past that you think it's important for us to know about or remember or think about. And I was also like, I really loved thinking about some of the things that Andrew Young said in MLK FBI. You know, specifically, he says at one point about, you know, he wanted us to know it was insane that like people with no money and no guns are going to change this nation. And I thought, that's a really important thing to hear right now. And I'm wondering if each of you could talk about, I guess, your own feelings, hopefully about hope or change, but your own feelings of what positive message people can draw from your films.
I would say this very simply and succinctly. This film basically tells you that there's a struggle back then and that the struggle continues. And that many of the things, many of the dog whistles that you hear in that film, you still hear them today in America. And in some ways, to me, that's in some ways very tragic. When I'm listening to that woman, one of the woman on the street saying about Dr. King, I don't like him because he's uppity. Or the other gentleman who says, he's even 10 times worse than what Hoover said. I mean, and then the other woman who says he was a communist and she shows that poster. I mean, all you have to do is listen to that and listen to some of our people today, and I won't name any names. Listen to some of our people today, and it's the same dog whistles. You know, the country is going to go into chaos. It'll be revolution. You know, people forget that King was, you know, he was a man of the people. He was out there protesting, you know, peaceful protesting. And people are peaceful protesting today. But he wasn't embraced. He wasn't really embraced by the population. You know, now that he is, because he's like iconic, but not back in the 60s. So it just shows you that the struggle continues, and that if you want to make change, you have to be out there in the streets. You have to protest. It's frightening to see how America still hasn't gotten it right.
Rachel described this as funhouse mirrors, so I'm echoing again Sam. So much of what Helen was railing against are things that we're still having to push back on, and the need for proper medical care, the value of everyone having the right to vote, the value of the fundamental value of dissent, and that's a sacred right that's not shouldn't be seen as subversive. The intrinsic problems of the capitalist model that can't be just corrected through congressional changes. But you asked for something positive. I mean, I think the positive is in how the spirit with which she fought throughout her life. That's why the film has the title it has, and that you know, she was fighting a white supremacist president with Woodrow Wilson. We're fighting one right now. The gravity of the issues is maybe, it at least feels as dire as it ever has. But you know, at the same time, we have someone not saying he's the embodiment of all my ideas of what a socialist politician would look like, but someone like Bernie Sanders, people would have said, there's no possible way in our society that you'd have even a couple of thousand people vote for someone who openly declares himself as a democratic socialist. And he got millions and millions of votes. And he also not only got those votes, but he was able to bring concepts of inequity to the larger democratic platform, and problems with tuition debt and food insecurity and the environment and things that I feel that increasingly that there's a growing groundswell around these long-term goals. And what are we even talking about when we're talking about socialism? One of the nicest succinct definitions I heard recently was at a concert by Billy Bragg, where he called it organized compassion. And I think that's something that's sorely lacking in a lot of our formal politics. And but I think that there's a hunger for that. Hopefully will be heard very loudly in the next couple of weeks.
Just to let people who are watching know that if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to start taking some of those as we keep talking. But I guess I would say the thing of hope that I found in connecting both of your films was something you alluded to, which is that, both Helen Keller and Martin Luther King were sort of seen as stepping out of their place. They got resistance for, stepping out of the roles that people wanted to assign to them when they started talking about politics. And yeah, it just the fact that they persevered in that, and I take hope in that they did what they did anyway and felt the need to.
Had to.
Yeah, had to.
Yeah.
So there's a question that's from the audience that's pretty similar to the question I just asked you. Sorry, Ryan, but slightly different for Sam Pollard, which is in the light of the current discussion surrounding racial tension and police brutality in the United States. Do you view your film any differently now as opposed to during production? And I guess I put a different spin on that, since you did kind of answer the question in the last question I asked you, which is to say, when you first started these projects, did you have any idea how, or any inkling of how much more relevant they might become?
No clue. No clue. And I only started mine 2.5 years ago, not 21 years ago, like John. So no clue. I mean, listen, I knew, and I think Ben and I both knew there'd be some relevance because America's history, racial history, is mired in this kind of stuff. But who knew what would happen in the spring with the pandemic, with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, with all the other deaths? Who knew how impactful that would be, not only in America, but in the world? I just came off a series for Discovery called Why We Hate. And we explored in those 6 hours the notion of where hate comes from, how it festers, how it can grow, how it can impact cultures and people and societies. But who knew that this film, to me, when I watched the King film a few nights ago, it seemed so relevant today, even more so than even what I thought it would be 2.5 years ago.
So here's a question, which is, the question is, if anything either of you came across in the archive surprised you?
Well, as I said, the footage of King watching his kids play with his parents there, the footage of James Earl Ray being arrested in London. I had never seen that material before. Some of the new speeches that we had of the King that was 16 millimeter that we hadn't seen before. And even the footage, which I might have seen, but I don't remember, when King was on the Merv Griffith show with Harry Belafonte, and he was really relaxed, talking about his upbringing, talking about his father. I don't remember seeing that material. So those were three things that really stood out to me in us doing our excavation.
One thing that occurs to me that was surprising was that while I started out from the point of view that this is largely an invisible side of Helen Keller's history and been expurgated from most of the orthodox tellings that I knew of, or film versions or plays about her life, when I actually went into the archives and you look at old newspapers from those years, this was talked about all the time. It was on the front pages of articles. There were pictures of her, not pictures that I could use that worked for the film, but they're portraits of her or drawings of her, and people wanting to know about her beliefs around this issue, because socialism wasn't a dirty word in the teens and early 20s in this country. It became one, but certainly wasn't.
So there's a question for John about, from a viewer who couldn't understand what Helen Keller was saying when you actually hear her voice at the end of the film. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your choice to leave that unsubtitled.
Courageous. John, you're courageous. I could never do that. That was courageous, because I listened to it and I said, well, I heard the first two words, but I didn't understand anything else. And I said, well, I guess he decided he's not going to put subtitles on it and let her just speak. Very courageous, man. I applaud you.
Well, I don't know about that, but thank you. But I will first say that I did recently do a closed caption version of the film, which the festival has, so folks can go that route. I could only find a handful of audio recordings of her voice. As the film mentioned, she herself felt very insecure about it, although she used it frequently. So I think there wasn't an effort to hold on to those recordings in the archives, or at least they're buried in ways that I haven't accessed. That, towards the end, was an interview that she did on a Rudy Valley radio show, and it was she was trying to raise awareness for an initiative, a blind initiative, support initiative that month. So even though Polly Thompson, her assistant, was with her, it wasn't on that broadcast simultaneously translated. It was put out that way, and so I had to listen to it a few times myself to hear it. And there's actually one word that I'm not 100% sure. I think the word is time, but you'll see a little question mark in the closed captions about that. But it felt right, because it was the end of the film, that we should have to really lean in closer and see what, if we could really hear her. Yeah, so maybe it's a braver choice than I realized. I didn't know that so many people were struggling with it, but
it's very brave, man. I mean, I've done films where people were hard to understand, and I would get frightened and say, well, let's put lower third, let's subtitle them. Very brave. The one thing that Rachel, that's fascinating about making films, I compare it to being a musician, and particularly a jazz musician. Every jazz musician brings their own particular aesthetic to how they want their music to be presented. And when I was watching John's film, I was saying, wow, man, he's like what I grew up with, the avant-garde musicians of the 60s and the 70s. So it's always fascinating to see other filmmakers work, to understand how they approach the notion of cinema and how they create. I mean, it's always a learning experience. And if you're a curious film person like I am, you appreciate, the idea that his expression of creativity is very different than mine, but I respect it tremendously.
Feelings mutual. Thank you, Sam.
Given that, do each of you have questions that you are in the back of your head about the other person's film or their practice that you were hoping to hear about during this conversation, or maybe hoping to ask yourself?
I thought your whole section about when she went to Hiroshima was really fascinating. I thought her interacting with the people there with Polly Thompson was fascinating. But the one question I had was that a dead raccoon, John?
It is, yeah.
I was trying to embrace, why are we seeing a dead raccoon with this particular voiceover? Okay.
One of my questions for you, Sam, was, since you were able to enlist James Comey in your piece, whether he needed to see the film and its perspective on the FBI before he agreed to add his thoughts to something.
No, he didn't ask at all. And one of my rules is that, I mean, unless I'm really pinned to the wall, I try never let the subject see anything, the people I interview see anything before I interview them. We just tell them what the film's about, and they have to trust that we're going to present them in a reasonable, decent light. No, he didn't ask any questions.
And have you gotten feedback from him since the film has?
No, we haven't heard anything. But, he's probably getting ready for his own TV movie that's coming on Sunday called The Comey Rule or whatever.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Yeah, with Jeff Daniels playing him. No, we had initially hoped to do him on camera, but then he said he would prefer just doing audio. So we set up an audio session with him, and we recorded him, and we asked him the questions over the phone. He was very open. He was nice. The FBI gentleman, Chuck Knox, the other gentleman, we went down to Houston, Texas, and spent 2 or 3 hours with him. He was really great. There's some great outtakes of what he was talking about being a member of the FBI back then.
And a really minor question that I wondered about, when King and his entourage do have that one meeting with Hoover, I thought I saw that Andrew Young was in that group that went into the.
He was there.
But I don't think we hear him commenting later as to what the tenor of that conversation.
Quite honestly, we didn't ask him about it because we hadn't seen that footage before we interviewed him. So if I had seen that footage, I would have probably asked him a question. But he's very kind of, it's like for me, for example, when I asked him about the assassination, he quickly says, emphatically, it wasn't James Earl Ray, and he didn't want to go any further than that. He had nothing else to say. I mean,
so he's the one that we hear on screen who talks about Raoul and that theory.
Yeah.
Okay, because we don't have the name on screen, I don't think, at that point, and I wondered.
No, yeah, it was Andy Young.
Great. I want to thank you both. Again, we're reaching the end of the hour, for having this conversation with each other and with us. Sorry to the audience that we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but it was really great to take a deeper dive into your practices. I want to remind people that in case you came to this conversation and hadn't yet seen both of these films, that they are both still available to rent until 8 p.m. Eastern Time on the 26th at the New York Film Festival Virtual Cinema. Obviously, I think this conversation should have whetted your appetite to see them, or maybe even watch them again if you saw them and then came to this conversation having seen them. So I hope you'll avail yourselves of that. And also thanks again to HBO for being the sponsor of these talks and making them free so that lots of people can have access to hearing about you and your films. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Sam.
Take care. Good meeting you. Have a good night.
Catch each other down the road somewhere.
Hopefully. Good.
Bye.